Hi everybody and welcome to my seminar. So today I'm going to be discussing the systematic victimization of women by the patriarchal institutions and this concept relative to the novel we read in class, A Thousand Splendid Suns. So the book A Thousand Splendid Suns was written by author Khaled Hosseini and it was published in May 22nd of 2007. Now, the main theme throughout the novel and one that should really be addressed is the patriarchal suppression of women in Middle Eastern countries, specifically in this case Afghanistan and the state of Kabul at the time. And so, as I mentioned, the book takes place over the course of a very harsh political climate in Afghanistan over the course of the years from 1970s to the early 2000s. So we'll get into a bit of a breakdown later in the presentation, but keep in mind that it was a very difficult time for Afghanistan and specifically women. So, quickly, I wanted to address my outside source and its connection to the novel. So, several years ago in 2018, a story was published about Khadija, and there's a thematic connection to the novel here. So, the article was published, and it's called "We're All Handcuffed in This Country." Why Afghanistan is Still the Worst Place in the World to Be a Woman. And this article was written by Lauren Bone. And while the events that take place in the novel A Thousand Splendid Suns were in the early 1970s to the early 2000s, Bone's article highlights the more recent current events that are taking place in Afghanistan. And Khadija was a woman who set herself on fire trying to escape the daily injustices faced by Afghani women in her country. And this is a very impactful symbol for what is taking place here. And it really can relate to the many things that Miriam and Layla experience throughout the novel in A Thousand Splendid Suns. So, my thesis statement that I wanted to address today that goes throughout the novel is the female characters in the novel Thousand Splendid Suns are suppressed by the unstable political climate of Afghanistan, in addition to the strict laws enforced by the Taliban, limiting their opportunity for education and to flourish in their own skin. So now I wanted to get into a bit of a breakdown of the history of Afghanistan, specifically Kabul and Herat, where are the two settings where the novel takes place. So in the 1960s, Zahir Shah was the final king of Afghanistan when he was overthrown by his cousin Mohammad Daoud Khan in 1973. And at this point in history, there was great discontent with the monarchy specifically in the urban regions of Afghanistan. So this includes Kabul and some of the other larger cities. Then, following in the 1980s, the Soviet Union pulled out their last troops out of Afghanistan, and this was following 9 years of direct involvement and occupation. So this was quite drastic, specifically for the rights they were defending in the name of women in the country. So this was quite the uproot of their daily lives and was very difficult for a lot of people in Afghanistan. While, with that said, was the end of a war and drastic fighting. Then, following in the 1990s, when the Taliban, so an ultra conservative religious faction, took control of Afghanistan and they implemented harsh Islamic law, which largely impacted women over anybody else. Then, following in the 2000s, when President Bush of the United States declared war on Afghanistan due to the events that took place in New York on 9/11. And so the American invasion set out, and their main goal was to take down the Taliban. So if you look here at these images, on the left we have Zahir Shah and Mohammad Khan, so early political figures in Afghanistan and early relative to the timeline of the novel, and then a more recent image on the right hand side, which was the 2001 American invasion. So I did want to do a quick breakdown of the female characters in the novel as I believe it's relevant to the topic, and many of the textual evidence I'm going to use today is relative to these women and their experiences in Afghanistan. So Miriam is a female lead. She was born in Herat and she lives at the Koba with her Nana, and she moves to Kabul where she marries Rashid, then unfortunately dies in Kabul after fighting for her rights. And so following is Nana. She's the mother of Miriam and she fights the social expectations of women in Islamic society. She has a very strong hate for men, specifically targeted towards Miriam's father, Jalil, and she dies in Herat at the Koba. And then there is Layla, who is in part two of the novel. She comes in. She's the daughter of Fariba and Hakim, and she's born in Kabul. She lives there until her family passes in a bombing, where she then becomes the wife of Rashid and the partner of Miriam. Following this, there's Fariba, who is the mother of Layla, and she's largely depressed by the deaths of her sons in battle. She has very little drive with the state of Islam, and until the Najibullah steps down in 1992, returning some semblance of hope, she really doesn't play much of a role in the novel except for being not much of a role model to her daughter Layla. And finally, there is Aziza, who comes in quite later on in the novel and is the daughter of Layla, who's brought up in the home with Miriam Rashid and then sent away to an orphanage due to the financial instability. And she's the daughter of Tariq. So, the main theme of patriarchal suppression of women throughout the novel can be grouped into three main categories. So, this can largely be attributed to the fact that there was a lack of female education and opportunity, the spousal and abuse, and direct oppression within their homes, and finally, the systematic sexism. So, as I mentioned, there was a great lack of education and resources for women. We see this in the novel with Miriam's inability from a young age to attend school. We witness young marriages for both Layla and Miriam, and there's a hidden education. We see Aziza, Layla, and Miriam all learning through indirect methods, or they receive no education at all. Few men in the story value the education for women and go out of their way to help the women. So my first piece of evidence takes place where Miriam has very little understanding of the world around her, specifically when she lives at the Koba, and her only source of education is her family friend and tutor, Mola Faizullah, and he's one of the few people in her life to give her advice and direction, and so she really values this relationship. And the quote goes as follows: Mola Faizullah admitted to Miriam that at times he did not understand the meaning of the Quran's words, but he said he liked the enchanting sounds of the Arabic words made when they rolled off his tongue. He said they comforted him and eased his heart. Moving on, so much of Layla and Miriam's education throughout the book is surrounding religion and learning about their country's history, and this is highlighted in the various points in the novel where Hakim, also known as Bobby, teaches them and brings them around the country. And he tries to share this knowledge with his daughter. So at one point in the novel, he brings them to the valley and looks at the Buddha, and he states, "The silence, the peace of it. I wanted you to experience it, but I also wanted you to see your country's heritage, children, to learn of its rich past." And this quote can also be seen as quite symbolic because, with Hakim hinting towards their country's heritage, he's really emphasizing the fact that at one point in history, the state of Islam was not as harsh of a place for women, and so this sort of restores hope in a sense for Layla, knowing that studying her country's heritage and their past, and that there might be a point in the future where things look up for them and provide her with that same opportunity that the women in the country once had. So, the women of the novel have quite a fundamental understanding of the political state of Afghanistan as they're being severely oppressed, although, with that said, the communist nation works in their favor slightly. So, this is a very impactful quote stated by Bobby, and I'll read it for you now. So, women have always had it hard in this country, Layla, but they're probably more free now under the communists and have more rights than they've ever had before, Bobby said, always lowering his voice, aware of how intolerant Mommy was to even remotely positive talk of the communists. But it's true, Bobby said. It's a good time to be a woman in Afghanistan, and you can take advantage of that, Layla. Of course, women's freedom, here, he shook his head ruefully, is also one of the reasons people out there took up arms in the first place. So this is very impactful, and it's sort of contributing and building on Layla's understanding of the state of Islam and why she has so little rights. Although, with the communist state and the uproot of the Taliban that will take place, there is more liberty to come for Layla and her rights as a woman. So, the next idea that contributes to the theme is spousal abuse and oppression. So, as we see throughout the novel, there are many pressures to marry to those without consent. Miriam's life is uprooted and she must move to a completely new city, all without uh, providing consent and agreeing to it. Rashid outlines specific rules for the wives in his home, and this involves assuming all household duties such as cooking, cleaning, and tending for the property and the husband's sexual needs. And Rashid abuses both Layla and Miriam in their marriage. So, my first piece of evidence in relation to the spousal abuse is prior to moving to Kabul and marrying Rashid, Miriam has had little exposure to the world outside of the Koba and the extent to which violence was taking place in Afghanistan. So, accredited to the many disappointments Miriam experiences growing up, she is used to suppressing her emotions, which is seen when she states, "It was disquieting to her that Rashid owned something whose sole purpose was to kill another person, but surely he kept it for their safety, her safety." And so Rashid's ownership of a gun is a good indicator to the type of man he is, and a good depiction of what life in Afghanistan was like at the time with the very harsh warlike state. Now, this quote strengthens the reader's understanding of the situation at hand and is foreshadowing the violent events that take place later in the novel. The following quote is highly relevant as the level of suppression Miriam was facing in her own home is only surface level to the little opportunities the world was able to present her with at the time. So, the following quote is, "A woman's face," he'd said, "is her husband's business only." Now, this is quite drastic as on top of the very little opportunity Miriam had outside of her own home, she as she had rarely been exposed to this harsh political climate, and to hear that a woman's face was not only not hers but owned by her husband whom she had only just met is a great indicator to see what life was like in Islam at the time, and how little control she had over her future and her fate, which we later see was very disappointing for her and she could only take for so much longer. So, the following quote is, "He was a man all those years without a woman, because she fault him for being the way God created him." Now, the phrase "boys will be boys" is commonly used in Western society, although the meaning of the phrase is partially different in Middle Eastern countries. There are many occurrences throughout the novel in which Miriam suppresses her own values to justify the behavior of her husband, and this is all behavior that she is very unfamiliar with. And the suppression of her own values and morals in her marriage is often highlighted and is one of the forms in which the audience is able to see this spousal abuse. So, moving on to the systematic sexism throughout the novel. So, over the course of the novel's timeline, the sexism grows progressively worse with the political state of the country. And when the Taliban takes over the country in the early 1990s, strict laws are put in place to uphold the current Islamic law. And although the laws largely impact women over men, so I created two tables here that I just want to outline some specific points. So, women's historic rights in Afghanistan, so they weren't always once as bad as they were under Taliban rule. Women received the right to vote in the 1920s, and as early as the 1960s, the Afghan constitution provided for equality for women. In 1997, or 77, women comprised over 50% of Afghan's highest legislative body, and although the Taliban claimed that they were acting in the best interests of women, the truth is that the Taliban regime cruelly reduced women and girls to poverty. It worsened their health and deprived them of their right to education and many times to practice their religion. So, with that said, the Taliban's version of Islam is not supported by the world's Muslims, and Afghanistan under the Taliban had one of the worst human rights records in the world. And these stats were provided by the Bureau of Democracy from 2001. So, following this, In Afghani society, women were not allowed to work, and in the later unstable state of their economy, many men were also laid off. And at this given point in the novel, Layla must surrender Aziza to an orphanage as Rashid states, insists that they no longer can afford a second child. And as Layla feels intense emotions of remorse, Kaka Zaman consoles her and explains that this is not her fault, but society has left her in a very difficult, almost impossible situation. He states, they bring shame on me as a Pashtun. They've disgraced the name of my people, and you're not alone, Hamshira. We get mothers like you all the time. All the time. Mothers who come here who can't feed their children because the Taliban won't let them go out and make a living. So don't blame yourself. No one here blames you. I understand. And this is quite powerful, as very seldomly throughout the novel does Layla receive any form of reassurance at how difficult her life has been. And so this is really comforting for her, and to know that she isn't a terrible mother, and sometimes the way Rashid may make her feel. So, my next quote is, at the time of the Taliban's rule in Afghanistan, women were unable to attend school, although, even worse so, they were rarely encouraged to learn, and very few men actually took the initiative to help support women in their learning. So, the readers witness the severity of the laws put in place at the time when Aziza explains her situation at the orphanage. She says, Aziza said Kaka Zaman made it a point to teach them something every day, reading and writing most days, sometimes geography, a bit of history or science, and something about plants and animals. But we do have to pull the curtains, Aziza said, so the Taliban don't see us. Kaka Zaman had knitting needles and a balls of yarn ready, she said, in case the Taliban inspection. And so this makes it quite evident that the state of Islam at the time was terrible and terrifying place for Aziza to be able to have the opportunity to learn. Although with that said, Kaka Zaman was one of the few men who really took the initiative to support her in this endeavor. Finally, in a symbolic manner, when the readers witness a pivotal moment in the story. So at the time of Miriam's death, she is asked to sign a document admitting to her wrongdoings and repenting for her sins, seeking forgiveness from Allah. She highlights the fact that at only 2 points in her life has she ever actually had to sign her name. And this is quite powerful, as in Western society, as women, we can think to every day, multiple times a day, we've likely had to write or sign our name in some sense. And Miriam, at only 2 points in her life, was given this opportunity. One, to commit herself to a man she had no love for in her marriage to Rashid, and finally to sign away her life, committing to her death. And so the weight of this very simple action is drastic and an accurate representation of the corrupted state of Afghanistan and how it directly affected women. So before they let her out, Miriam was given a document, told to sign beneath her statement and the mullah's statement. As the 3 Taliban watched, Miriam wrote it out, her name, the mim, the re, the ya, and the mim, remembering the last time she signed her name to a document, 27 years before, at Jalil's table, beneath the watchful gaze of another mullah. So, with the weight of today's discussion, I just wanted to leave some concluding notes. So, due to the various factors, including the fragile political state, the vicious Taliban rules, in addition to the blatant sexism from the patriarchal institutions, the women in Afghanistan have been suffering for centuries. The novel A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini highlights the aggressive nature of men in Afghanistan and how it directly impacts women. So, women suffer directly and indirectly through their lack of education, opportunity, and opportunity thereof, spousal abuse, and systematic sexism. Although, as we see at the end of the novel, with the American invasion that took place, slight hope was restored, as Americans coming in, corrupting the Taliban's influence, restored certain rights for women. So, thank you for listening, and to leave you with a few thoughts today, I wanted to get into my discussion questions. So, if Middle Eastern countries such as Afghanistan provide equal opportunity for both men and women, do you believe greater advancements will be made within their societies? If so, what kind of advancements? My second question is, with Afghani women suffering from years of oppression, do you believe women will ever be completely liberated and seen as equals to men? Will there be women in politics? And finally, do you believe with women assimilating into societal roles, there will be less war and aggression in the years to come in Afghanistan? And here are my works cited for today. Thank you so much for listening.